Conjoined twins. What's the worst thing anyone's ever said to you? What's the worst thing anyone's ever said to you? My sister Valerie and I were conjoined twins connected at the torso. The absolute worst part of being conjoined wasn't the physical stuff. It was dating. When I was 22, I went on a date with a guy I'd met at a bookstore. We showed up to the restaurant, and halfway through dinner, he leaned in and whispered, "So, is this a threesome situation?" Because I'm into it. Valerie heard him and her face went bright red. I got up to leave and he grabbed my arm. "Come on, don't be sensitive. You had to know I was thinking it." Another time I matched with a guy on a dating app and we talked for 3 weeks before meeting up. I told him about being conjoined and sent pictures and he said it was totally fine. We met at a bar and the first thing he said was, "Okay, but which one of you am I actually dating?" Then he laughed like it was a joke. The worst was a guy who made it through 4 dates before he pulled out his phone and asked if he could film us kissing because his friends would never believe this. When I said absolutely not, he got mad and said I was being unfair because he'd put in all this effort. Valerie started crying and he called us dramatic. After that, we pretty much gave up on dating entirely. Then I met Carlos at a coffee shop when he asked if the seat next to us was taken. Valerie had her headphones in reading a book. He started talking to me about what I was reading and we ended up chatting for an hour. When he asked for my number, I took a deep breath and explained that I was a conjoined twin. He looked at Valerie and then back at me. "I'm not blind. I can see that. So when can I take you out?" Our first date was at an Italian restaurant. Valerie brought a book and headphones and angled herself away as much as she could. Carlos kept his entire focus on me. He asked about my job and my hobbies and what kind of movies I liked. When the waiter brought the check, Carlos didn't make any weird comments about paying for 2 people. He just paid and said he'd love to see me again. On our third date, we were walking through a park and he reached for my hand. He'd figured out which hand to hold so it felt natural. When he kissed me goodnight, he put his hand on my cheek and looked only at me. It was the first time I'd ever felt like someone saw me as just me. A few months in, we were watching a movie at my apartment when Carlos paused it. "I need to ask you something and I don't want it to be weird." My stomach dropped. "Here it comes," I thought. "I really care about you," he said. "And I want to make sure I'm being respectful to both of you. Is there anything I should be doing differently?" Valerie pulled out her headphones. "You're doing great, Carlos. Honestly." He smiled at her. "I just want to make sure everyone's comfortable." That was the moment I knew I loved him. 6 months in, Carlos and I were cooking dinner together when he turned to me. "I love you. I've loved you for a while now, and I needed to tell you." I started crying and said it back. Valerie turned her headphones up louder and focused hard on her book to give us as much mental privacy as possible. A year later, Carlos took me back to the coffee shop where we met. He got down on one knee right there in front of everyone. "You're the most incredible person I've ever met. Will you marry me?" Valerie was crying as hard as I was. Planning the wedding was magical. Carlos came to every dress fitting and helped us find a seamstress who could create something beautiful that worked for both our bodies. Valerie kept insisting on styles she knew I'd love even when they weren't her preference. Carlos's family welcomed us completely. His mom hugged both of us and said she was so happy to have us joining the family. The day of the wedding arrived and I couldn't stop shaking with excitement. Valerie helped me with my makeup and kept telling me how beautiful I looked. We put on the custom dress we'd spent months designing. It was perfect. Walking down the aisle felt surreal. Everyone we loved was there watching. Valerie squeezed my hand and whispered, "You deserve this." Carlos was standing at the altar in his suit, but something was wrong with his face. He was pale and sweating. His hands were shaking. I thought maybe he was just nervous. We reached the front and I smiled at him. He didn't smile back. He was staring past me. The officiant began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Carlos held up his hand. "Wait. Stop. I'm sorry." The room went completely silent. My heart was pounding. Carlos's eyes were filled with tears, but he still wasn't looking at me. He was staring at Valerie. "I can't do this," he said. "I tried so hard. I wanted this to work so badly." Now he finally looked at me and I could see he was crying. "You're amazing. But Valerie is everything you are and more. I love her more than I ever loved you. I wish it had been Valerie from the start." He leaned in to kiss her. Valerie jerked away from him so hard that we both stumbled backward, and she screamed into the microphone that was still clipped to my dress. Her voice echoed through the speakers and bounced off the walls of the ballroom. Carlos froze with his hand still up near her face and he looked confused like he really thought she was going to kiss him back. The wedding guests jumped to their feet and started shouting questions at us and at each other and at Carlos. Someone knocked over a chair and it clattered on the floor. I stood there in my custom wedding dress with my sister shaking against me, and I couldn't make my brain work. This was supposed to be my wedding day. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. Hala Navarro stepped between us and Carlos with both her hands raised and told him to step back right now. Her voice cut through all the noise and people went quiet for a second. Carlos started talking to Valerie and ignoring Hala completely. He said he'd been in love with Valerie for months, and he thought she felt the same way because of how she smiled at him sometimes. Valerie was crying so hard she couldn't breathe, and I could feel her chest heaving against mine. I finally found my voice and told Carlos he was insane. I told him we were leaving and he needed to stay away from both of us. My voice sounded strange and far away like someone else was talking. We turned toward the aisle to get out of there, but our dress wasn't made for moving fast. The train was long and heavy, and we nearly tripped over it. Ronan came out of nowhere from where he'd been sitting in the guest section. He grabbed the train and lifted it so we could walk faster. He stayed behind us like a wall between us and everyone else. The guests moved out of our way like we had some disease they might catch. I could hear Carlos's mother Madeline crying and saying, "What is he doing and what is he thinking?" Carlos kept calling after Valerie to please just listen to him. He said her name over and over. We made it to the bridal suite and Ronan helped us through the door. He told us he wasn't letting anyone through, and then he went back outside and closed the door. Valerie and I stood in the middle of the room still in our wedding dress. We were both shaking. So hard the fabric made a rustling sound. I couldn't look at her face because if I looked at her, this would all be real. I stared at our reflection in the big mirror on the wall. Two people in a beautiful white dress at the worst moment of their lives. The dress had taken months to design and fit properly for both our bodies. Now it just felt heavy and wrong. Valerie broke the silence and whispered that she never did anything, and she swore she never encouraged him. She couldn't finish the sentence because she was crying too hard. I knew she didn't do anything wrong. I knew this wasn't her fault. But there was this tiny, terrible voice in my head asking how I didn't notice something was wrong. The voice asked what Valerie did that made Carlos think she wanted this. I hated that voice, but I couldn't make it stop. The silence between us filled up with everything we weren't saying to each other. Someone started pounding on the door and Carlos's voice came through. He said he needed to explain, and this was all a big misunderstanding. He said he loved Valerie and she deserved to know the truth. Ronan's voice said something I couldn't hear through the door, and then Carlos went quiet. Valerie was looking at me now and waiting for me to say something. I finally managed to say we needed to get out of here. Those were the only words my brain could form. Ronan knocked and came back in. He told us the venue coordinator was having security remove Carlos from the building. He asked what we wanted to do about the reception. The reception with the expensive food and the band and the cake and 200 guests who just watched my guy confess love for my sister. I started laughing because the whole thing was so crazy it broke something in my brain. Then I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe and Valerie was holding me up. We were still connected at the torso in this stupid dress that was supposed to make me feel beautiful. The venue coordinator came in with the woman who made our dress. They both looked horrified and sorry for us. They helped us into the bathroom attached to the bridal suite. They had to cut some of the fancy buttons and ties because we were shaking too much to undo them ourselves. We ended up in our regular clothes that we'd brought to change into for leaving on our trip. That made everything worse because I'd packed those clothes this morning thinking about getting changed with Carlos to go to the airport. Now we were just two people in jeans and shirts standing in a bathroom at a wedding that didn't happen. Ronan drove us home in his car. We sat in the back seat and both stared out opposite windows. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts, but I couldn't look at it. I couldn't face anyone's questions or their pity or their need to know what happened. Valerie's phone was buzzing too, and she finally just turned it off completely. I followed her and turned mine off too because the sound was making my head hurt. We got back to our apartment and everything was exactly how we left it this morning. My makeup was still scattered all over the bathroom counter. Our breakfast dishes were still in the sink. Ronan asked if we wanted him to stay, but I told him we needed to be alone. He made us promise to call him if we needed anything, and then he left. The door closed behind him, and Valerie and I were alone in the apartment that was supposed to be empty tonight while we were on our trip for after the wedding. We ended up on the couch without really deciding to go there, just sort of drifting into the living room because we had to go somewhere. I sat down and Valerie sat down because we're connected at the torso, and that's how it works. We were still wearing the regular clothes we'd changed into at the venue, jeans and shirts that were supposed to be for traveling to the airport. My phone was on the coffee table where I'd left it this morning when everything was normal. Valerie's hands were in her lap and she wasn't moving. I kept replaying the moment when Carlos said he loved her, trying to figure out when it happened. When did he decide? Was it during our engagement when he came to dress fittings? Was it months ago when we were just dating? I kept going through memories looking for signs I missed. Every time he smiled at both of us, was he really smiling at her? Every time he asked if we were both comfortable, was he checking on her specifically? Valerie was so still beside me that I knew she was doing the same thing, going through the same memories from her angle. The silence felt different from our normal, comfortable quiet. This silence was heavy with questions neither of us wanted to ask out loud. I wanted to ask her if she noticed anything, if Carlos ever looked at her wrong, if he ever said anything when I wasn't paying attention. But asking meant suggesting maybe she did something and I knew she didn't. My brain knew that. But there was this tiny voice asking anyway. The apartment was too quiet. Usually we'd have music on or the TV going, but right now the silence pressed down on everything. I could hear the fridge humming in the kitchen and cars passing outside and Valerie breathing next to me. We sat there for hours. I don't know how many hours. Time felt weird and stretched out. My legs got stiff from not moving, but I didn't want to get up because getting up meant deciding what to do next. And I had no idea what came next. How do you move forward from your wedding getting stopped at the altar? What's the normal thing to do after your guy confesses love for your sister in front of everyone you know? Around midnight, Valerie finally spoke. Her voice came out small and broken, and she asked if I wanted her to apologize. I turned to look at her, and her eyes were red from crying earlier, and she looked scared. I told her there was nothing to apologize for because she didn't do anything wrong. The words came out automatically because they were true. She didn't do anything. She never encouraged Carlos. She always angled away during our dates and barely talked to him directly. But even as I said it, I could feel this weird distance growing between us, like something had shifted that couldn't shift back. She asked if I believed that, if I really believed she didn't do anything. I didn't answer right away because I was trying to figure out if I did believe it. I knew logically that she didn't do anything wrong. But there was still this tiny, terrible voice in my head asking questions I hated. My hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. Valerie started crying again, these quiet tears that ran down her face without any sound. She said she knew I blamed her, and I said I didn't, but my voice didn't sound sure enough. She said she could feel me pulling away from her, and she was right. I could feel it too. This distance that had never existed before. This space between us even though we were physically connected. I wanted to fix it, but I didn't know how. I was too tired and too hurt and too confused to figure out how to make it better. We eventually got up from the couch and moved to our bedroom. Neither of us suggested changing into pajamas or brushing our teeth or doing any of our normal nighttime things. We just lay down on the bed still in our jeans and shirts. The bed was a special size we'd had custom made to fit both of us comfortably. We'd been sleeping in this bed for years, but tonight it felt wrong. It felt too small and too big at the same time. Too small because we were stuck together processing this nightmare. Too big because it was supposed to be empty tonight while we were in a honeymoon suite at some fancy hotel Carlos had booked. I'd been so excited about that hotel. I'd looked at pictures of the room online and imagined waking up there tomorrow morning as a married person. Now I was in my regular bed in my regular apartment, and nothing would ever be regular again. I could feel Valerie awake beside me. Her breathing was all wrong for sleep, too fast and too shallow. I knew she could feel the same thing from me. We were both just lying there in the dark, pretending to try to sleep. The clock on my nightstand glowed 12:47 in blue numbers, then 1:15, then 1:38. I watched the numbers change and tried not to think about anything, but my brain wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Carlos's face at the altar, saw him looking past me at Valerie, heard him saying she was everything I was and more. My phone started buzzing around 2 in the morning. It was on my nightstand, and the vibration was loud in the quiet room. I picked it up and saw dozens of messages from Carlos. I opened them, even though I knew I shouldn't. He was saying he was sorry for the timing, but not for his feelings. He said he'd been in love with Valerie for months and couldn't go through with marrying me knowing the truth. He said it wouldn't be fair to any of us to start a marriage built on a lie. He said Valerie had been giving him signs, and he knew she felt the same way. He said he had to be honest before we made a terrible mistake. The messages kept coming while I was reading them. He said he thought about telling me sooner, but didn't know how. He said he tried to fight his feelings, but they were too strong. He said Valerie deserved to know that someone saw her as beautiful and special. Each message made me feel sicker. This was insane. He was talking about Valerie like they had some kind of relationship, like there was something between them that existed outside his head. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but I just kept reading because I couldn't stop. I showed Valerie the messages without saying anything, just held the phone where she could see it. I watched her face go white as she read them. She started shaking her head before she even finished reading. She said she never gave him any signs, her voice getting louder and more upset. She said she was always careful to angle away during our dates. She said she barely even talked to him directly. She said she never smiled at him except when he made me laugh, and she was happy for me. I believed her. I did. But I could also see how Carlos might have misread things. When Valerie smiled because I was happy, he might have thought she was smiling at him. When she was polite and said thank you for including her in plans, he might have thought she was interested. The thought that her just existing near him was enough to make him create this whole fantasy made everything more complicated. It meant she couldn't have done anything differently. It meant just being Valerie was the problem in Carlos's mind. She kept reading the messages and crying and saying she didn't want this. She never wanted this. I put my phone down and we lay there in the dark, not talking. What was there to say? Carlos had built a whole relationship with Valerie in his imagination and destroyed our real relationship in the process. We spent the next day fielding calls from family and friends. My phone started ringing around 9 in the morning and didn't stop. Everyone wanted to know what happened, why the wedding got called off, if we were okay. I let most of them go to voicemail because I couldn't explain this story over and over. I couldn't handle the questions about whether Valerie did something to encourage him. I could hear it in people's voices even when they didn't ask directly. This curiosity about what she did to make Carlos fall for her. Like she must have done something. Like Carlos couldn't have just invented feelings out of nothing. My sister's phone was ringing too. Her mom called and Valerie actually answered. I could hear her trying to explain through tears that she didn't want this, didn't ask for this, would never do that to me. Her mom was saying she knew that. She believed her. But I could hear the confusion in her voice too. Everyone was confused because the situation was insane. How do you explain that the groom stopped the wedding to confess love for the bride's conjoined twin sister? It sounded like something from a bad movie, not real life. But it was real, and we were living it. And everyone we knew was calling to ask about it. Carlos's mother, Madeline, called me directly around noon, and I made the mistake of answering. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying she was sorry. She was so sorry. She didn't understand what Carlos was thinking. She said she was horrified and ashamed of her son. She said she'd raised him better than this, and she didn't know where this came from. She said Carlos was insisting that Valerie led him on somehow, but she didn't believe him. She said she knew us, and she knew Valerie would never do that. Her sympathy somehow made it worse because it meant this really happened. It wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. Carlos's own mother was apologizing for him, which meant it was real, and everyone knew about it. I told Madeline it wasn't her fault and she didn't need to apologize. She said she wanted to do something to help, to make it right somehow. I told her there was nothing she could do and we needed space from Carlos's family right now. She said she understood and would respect that. After I hung up, I felt worse than before the call. Madeline was a nice person who didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of her son's breakdown or whatever this was. Ronan came over that evening with bags of Chinese takeout. He didn't call first, just showed up and knocked on the door. When I opened it, he held up the bags and said he correctly guessed we haven't eaten. He was right. We hadn't eaten anything since breakfast yesterday before the wedding. He came in and unpacked the food on our coffee table and turned on some random comedy show on TV. He didn't ask questions or want to talk about what happened. He just sat with us and made sure we ate something and laughed at the stupid show. His presence was the first thing that felt normal since the altar. I was grateful for his friendship in a way I'd never been before. He didn't treat us like we were broken or like this was some fascinating disaster to discuss. He just brought food and sat with us like a normal Tuesday evening. When he left around 9, he made us promise to call him if we needed anything. He said he meant it, anytime, day or night. After he left, the apartment felt emptier than before he came. The dress shop owner called the next morning. She said she needed to discuss what to do with our custom wedding dress. Her voice was gentle, like she was talking to someone who might break. She said the dress was still at her shop and she wanted to know our plans for it. The dress cost thousands of dollars and took months of fittings to create something that worked for our bodies. We'd spent hours in that shop trying on samples and picking fabrics and discussing how to make something beautiful that fit us both. The seamstress had been so excited about the project, said it was the most interesting design challenge she'd ever had. Now it was just sitting in the shop as evidence of the worst day of our lives. The owner offered to try to resell it, but we both knew that was impossible. No one else had our specific body configuration. The dress was made for exactly 2 people, and those 2 people were us. It was essentially worthless except as a very expensive reminder of what didn't happen. I told her to donate it or throw it away or whatever she wanted to do with it. I never wanted to see it again. She said she'd take care of it, and again her voice had that gentle, careful tone that made me want to scream. We started getting bills and invoices for the wedding over the next few days. The venue sent their final invoice charging us for the full reception, even though no one ate the food or danced to the band. The caterer wanted payment for the meal they'd prepared. The photographer sent a bill for showing up even though there were no wedding photos to take. The florist charged us for the flowers that decorated the venue. Every envelope that arrived felt like another punch. I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and added up the numbers. We were out tens of thousands of dollars for a wedding that ended at the altar. Money we'd saved for months. Money our families had contributed. All gone for nothing. I still had to figure out what to do about the honeymoon tickets and hotel reservations. The resort in Mexico where we were supposed to be right now. I'd have to call and cancel and probably pay cancellation fees because we were past the deadline. I'd have to call the airline about the tickets. Every single thing we'd planned and paid for had to be undone, and each thing cost money to undo. I looked at the stack of bills and felt this crushing weight of how much Carlos's decision at the altar was going to cost us in actual dollars, not even counting the emotional cost. 2 days later, my phone started buzzing again with texts from Carlos. He sent 5 messages in a row saying he needed to talk to us in person, that texting wasn't enough to explain what he was feeling. He wrote that he owed us both a real conversation about everything that happened at the altar. I showed the messages to Valerie and watched her face go pale as she read them. She asked in a quiet voice if I wanted to hear him out, and I told her absolutely not. There was nothing he could say that would make any of this better. Her whole body relaxed when I said that, and she admitted she didn't want to see him either. She said the thought of being in the same room with him made her feel sick to her stomach. I blocked his number on my phone and told her to do the same on hers. A week after the wedding, I woke up to Valerie screaming beside me. Her whole body was shaking so hard it jerked both of us in the bed. I grabbed her arms and asked what was wrong, and she kept screaming for a few more seconds before her eyes actually focused on me. She was crying and gasping for air, and it took her a full minute to calm down enough to talk. She told me she'd been dreaming that Carlos was forcing her to kiss him, and she couldn't get away because we're connected at the torso. In the dream, she couldn't protect herself or me, and he just kept coming closer no matter how much she tried to pull back. I held her while she cried and felt this terrible guilt wash over me. I'd been so focused on my own pain and betrayal that I hadn't fully thought about what this was doing to Valerie. She had her own version of this nightmare to process, and I'd barely acknowledged it. She didn't choose to be part of Carlos's confession, and she couldn't escape the fallout any more than I could. We tried to get back into some kind of normal routine over the next few days, but everything felt wrong. I couldn't make myself go back to work yet because I couldn't face my coworkers and their questions and pity. Valerie usually read or worked on her hobbies while I was working, but now she was jumpy and anxious all the time. Every sound made her flinch, and she couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes. We were both moving through our apartment like ghosts, going through the motions of making food and getting dressed without really being present. The silence between us felt heavy and uncomfortable in a way it never had before. 2 weeks after the wedding, our apartment intercom buzzed in the middle of the afternoon. I pressed the button to ask who it was, and Carlos's voice came through the speaker. He was begging to talk to Valerie, saying he just needed 5 minutes to explain himself to her. Valerie panicked immediately, grabbing my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. I told Carlos through the intercom to leave right now or I was calling the police. He kept talking like he hadn't heard me, insisting that Valerie deserved to hear his side of things. He said she was controlled by me and couldn't make her own choices. I hung up the intercom and called Ronan, my hands shaking so bad I could barely dial. Ronan showed up 15 minutes later and found Carlos still standing outside our building. I watched from our apartment window as Ronan physically escorted Carlos down the street, one hand on his arm steering him away. Carlos was shouting the whole time that Valerie was being kept from him against her will. After Ronan came back upstairs, he sat with us on the couch and said we might want to consider getting a restraining order. The suggestion hit me hard because I'd never thought of Carlos as someone we needed legal protection from. He was supposed to be safe, supposed to be the one person who saw me as more than my condition. Now he was a threat, and we needed the courts to keep him away from us. The reality of that was so twisted I couldn't fully process it. Ronan gave us the name of a family lawyer he knew, and helped us set up an appointment for the next day. The lawyer's office was in a tall building downtown with an accessible entrance. The lawyer herself was a woman in her 50s who shook both our hands and didn't stare at our connection. We sat down and explained what happened at the wedding, showed her the text Carlos had sent, and told her about him showing up at our apartment. She took notes and asked specific questions about dates and times, but never asked anything invasive about being conjoined twins. She focused entirely on documenting Carlos's behavior and his refusal to accept no for an answer. At the end of the meeting, she told us we had solid grounds for a restraining order based on the harassment. Going to the courthouse to file the paperwork meant going out in public for the first time since the wedding. People stared at us like they always did, but now I was paranoid that they knew about what happened. I kept thinking they'd heard about the wedding disaster somehow and were judging us. Valerie was so anxious she was trembling the entire time we were there, her hand gripping mine in a way that hurt. I realized we were both developing a fear of public spaces that we'd never had before. The courthouse was full of people and noise, and every person who looked at us felt like a threat. We filled out the forms and submitted them and left as fast as we could. A week later, the restraining order got approved by a judge. Carlos was legally required to stay at least 500 feet away from us at all times. His brother Tyler called my phone that evening to apologize on Carlos's behalf. He said Carlos was struggling with mental health issues right now, and Tyler wanted us to know he was sorry. I told Tyler that Carlos's mental health was not our problem anymore, and that he needed to make sure Carlos respected the restraining order. Tyler actually agreed with me and said he'd make sure Carlos understood how serious this was. 3 weeks after the wedding, I finally went back to work because we needed the income and I couldn't hide in our apartment forever. My boss, Elliot, pulled me aside first thing when I walked in and told me to take whatever time I needed. He said everyone understood if I wasn't ready to be back yet. The kindness in his voice made me start crying right there in his office. He awkwardly patted my shoulder and told me the company's employee assistance program offered free counseling sessions if I wanted them. My coworker Lily became an unexpected source of support over the next few days. She ran interference when other coworkers got too curious or asked invasive questions about what happened. She brought me coffee without me asking and made excuses when I needed to step away from my desk for a few minutes. She never asked for details or explanations, just quietly helped make things easier. Valerie brought her book and headphones to work like she always did, but I could tell she was more anxious than usual in the office. She kept looking around like she was worried someone would say something about Carlos or ask questions she didn't want to answer. That evening, Jason called my phone and I almost didn't answer because I was exhausted from being back at work. He started by asking how I was doing in that careful voice people use when they don't actually want details. I told him I was managing and waited for whatever he really wanted to say. He cleared his throat and explained that he'd been talking to Carlos and wanted me to know he was staying friends with him because they'd known each other since college. I felt my whole body go tense and asked what he meant by that. Jason said he thought there were two sides to every story, and Carlos was going through a really hard time mentally. I interrupted him and said there was no version of events where stopping a wedding to confess love for the bride's conjoined sister was acceptable. Jason got defensive and told me I was being unfair, that Carlos was sick and needed support from his friends. I asked if Jason understood that Carlos had violated our restraining order and was harassing us. He went quiet for a second and then said he didn't think I was seeing the full picture. I told Jason that if he was choosing Carlos, then he was choosing wrong, and I hung up and blocked his number because I didn't have energy for people who thought this situation was complicated. Valerie had heard the whole conversation and she looked pale and shaky. She asked if we were going to lose all our friends over this, and I didn't know what to tell her. A month after the wedding, I woke up in the middle of the night because Valerie was breathing weird next to me. I turned to look at her and she was staring at the ceiling with tears running down her face. I asked what was wrong and she didn't answer at first. Then she admitted she'd been having panic attacks when I wasn't paying attention to her. I sat up as much as I could and asked her to explain. She said she was afraid that I secretly blamed her, that our relationship would never recover from this, that she'd ruined my life by just existing. Her words broke my heart because I could hear how much she'd been suffering without telling me. She kept apologizing and saying she knew it wasn't logical, but she couldn't stop thinking that if she wasn't here, none of this would have happened. I held her hand and told her we needed help, that we couldn't heal from this alone. She nodded and asked if I thought therapy could actually work for people like us. I said I didn't know, but we had to try. The next morning, I started researching therapists who had experience with conjoined twins and trauma. It turned out to be a very specific and small pool of options. Most therapists I contacted said they didn't have the right expertise, or their offices weren't accessible for our needs. After 2 weeks of searching, I found Nora Montgomery, who specialized in complex family dynamics, and had actually worked with conjoined twins before. I called her office and explained our situation, and she said she'd be happy to meet with us for an initial consultation. Her office was on the ground floor of a medical building with wide doorways and accessible bathrooms. When we met her, she was in her 50s with kind eyes, and she didn't stare at us or ask invasive questions about being conjoined. She focused entirely on what we needed help with and how she might support us. By the end of the consultation, I knew she was the right choice because she treated us like people first. Our first real therapy session with Nora was harder than I expected. She asked us to each describe the wedding day from our individual perspectives without interrupting each other. I went first and talked about the shock and betrayal and humiliation of Carlos stopping everything at the altar. Then Valerie described her experience, and I realized how different it was from mine, even though we were physically in the exact same place. She said when Carlos first held up his hand to stop the ceremony, she thought he was having a medical emergency or a panic attack. She didn't understand at first that he was seriously confessing feelings for her specifically. She thought maybe he was confused or having some kind of mental breakdown. When he said he loved her more than me, she felt like she was going to throw up. She kept thinking this couldn't be real, that it had to be some kind of nightmare. Hearing her describe the horror and confusion and guilt made me understand that she had her own trauma from this that was separate from mine. Nora wrote notes and asked clarifying questions, and helped us see that we'd both been carrying different versions of the same terrible day. In our second session, Nora asked if we'd talked about how this changed our relationship to each other, not just to Carlos. The question sat heavy in the room because we hadn't. We'd been avoiding it completely. Valerie started crying and admitted she felt like her existence was a burden to me now. She said she must wish sometimes that I was alone so this couldn't have happened. I told her I'd never wished that, and I didn't now. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was completely true. There had been moments in the past month where I'd thought about how different my life would be if I could just walk away from all of this. Nora asked me to sit with that feeling instead of pushing it away. She said it was normal to have complicated thoughts after trauma, and that acknowledging them didn't make me a bad person. Valerie looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, and I realized we were both scared of what the other one was thinking. In our third session, Nora suggested that Valerie might benefit from some individual therapy time in addition to our joint sessions. My immediate reaction was panic, because how would that work when we couldn't physically separate? Nora explained she could meet with Valerie while I wore headphones and focused on something else in the same room. She said it would give Valerie space to process her own feelings without worrying about my reactions. Valerie looked hopeful for the first time in weeks, and I realized she needed space from me that our bodies wouldn't allow. I agreed even though it scared me because I'd never had an experience that Valerie wasn't part of. Nora said she had a colleague named Cosima Huffman, who specialized in individual trauma work, and would be perfect for Valerie. We scheduled the first session for the following week. Valerie started seeing Cosima twice a week, and I sat in the waiting room with noise-canceling headphones reading or working on my laptop. Not knowing what Valerie was saying in therapy created this weird anxiety in me. I kept wondering what she was telling Cosima, whether she was talking about me, whether she was processing feelings I didn't know about. It felt like she was having experiences I wasn't part of, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I recognized this was unhealthy codependency that I needed to work on, but recognizing it didn't make it easier. After each session, Valerie would come out looking tired but also lighter somehow. She never told me what they talked about, and I tried not to ask because I knew she needed that privacy. 2 months after the wedding, I came home from work to find an envelope on our doorstep. There was no return address, and my stomach dropped when I saw it. I opened it and found a letter from Carlos that someone had delivered for him. The letter was addressed to Valerie and full of his feelings and interpretations of their relationship that never existed. He described moments I remembered completely differently. He wrote about a time at dinner when Valerie smiled at something he said, and he knew in that moment she felt the same way he did. I remembered that dinner and Valerie had smiled because I made a joke, not because of anything Carlos did. He talked about how she always angled her body toward him during our dates when actually she was angling away to give us privacy. Reading his delusions made me both angry and scared, because he'd created this entire fantasy that had nothing to do with reality. He ended the letter by saying he knew I was keeping them apart, but he would wait for her forever. I called the police right away and reported the restraining order violation. They took the letter as evidence and said they'd contact Carlos with a warning. The officer explained that since he'd used a third party to deliver it, there might not be enough for an arrest, but they'd make sure he understood the consequences of further contact. That evening, Tyler called my phone. His voice was more serious than the last time we talked. He said he was putting Carlos in intensive therapy and making sure he understood he needed to leave us alone. Tyler sounded genuinely worried about his brother's mental state. He kept saying Carlos wasn't thinking clearly and needed professional help. I felt a flash of sympathy before remembering that Carlos's issues weren't my responsibility anymore. I told Tyler I appreciated him taking it seriously, but we needed Carlos to stay away completely. Tyler promised he would make sure of it. In our next therapy session, Nora asked me what I was most angry about beyond the obvious betrayal. I had to think about it because there were so many layers to my anger. Then I realized I was most angry that Carlos made our conjoined status the center of the drama. He turned what was supposed to be proof that someone could love me as an individual into the ultimate evidence that I wasn't seen as separate from Valerie. All those years of dealing with guys who fetishized us or couldn't see past our physical connection, and Carlos seemed different. He seemed like he understood that I was my own person. But in the end, he reduced us both to our physical connection in the worst possible way. He proved that all my dating fears were justified, that no one would ever really see me as just me. Nora listened and then asked if I believed that was true, or if that was the story my trauma was telling me. I didn't have an answer. That evening after our therapy session, Valerie sat on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, the posture she always took when she needed to say something difficult. She told me Cosima had asked her a question during their individual session that afternoon. The question was when she last did something just for herself, something she chose without thinking about my preferences or our shared schedule. Valerie admitted she couldn't answer because she didn't know. She said we've always coordinated everything because our bodies require it, but somewhere along the way she stopped even considering what she wanted separate from what we needed as a unit. She looked at me and said she wanted to start exploring hobbies and interests that belonged only to her, even though I'd be physically present while she did them. I felt this weird mix of relief and fear because part of me wanted her to have that independence, but another part worried about what it meant for us. Over the next week, we started making small changes to how we operated day to day. Valerie signed up for an online creative writing class that met Tuesday and Thursday mornings during my work hours. She didn't ask my opinion on the class or check if the schedule worked for me first, just sent me the confirmation email after she'd already registered. The first morning of class, I sat at my desk working on spreadsheets while she put in her headphones and logged into the virtual session. I could see her screen angled away from me, could see her typing notes and participating in the chat, but I had no idea what the instructor was saying or what stories the other students were sharing. The parallel activities in the same physical space felt strange at first, like we were occupying two different worlds while connected at the torso. But after a few sessions, it started feeling good, like we were practicing a kind of independence that our bodies would never allow in the traditional sense. Valerie would finish class and tell me a little about what they'd discussed, but she didn't share everything, and I didn't ask. 3 months after the wedding, I opened my email one morning to find a message from Hala. The subject line just said, "checking in," and I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. She wrote that she'd been thinking about us constantly since the wedding, that in 15 years of officiating ceremonies, she'd never witnessed anything like what Carlos did at the altar. She said she hoped we were doing okay, and offered to meet for coffee if we thought it might help to talk. She included her personal phone number and said no pressure, just wanted us to know she was thinking of us. I showed the email to Valerie, and she made a face that said she was skeptical about Hala's motives. I was curious, though, wanted to hear what Hala had to say from her perspective as someone who saw the whole thing unfold. We agreed to meet her the following Saturday at a coffee shop 3 blocks from our apartment. Hala was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner table with 3 cups of coffee in front of her. She stood up when she saw us, and her face showed genuine concern, not the curiosity or pity we usually got from people who knew our story. She gestured to the chairs and we sat down, Valerie angling herself slightly away out of habit. Hala pushed 2 of the coffee cups toward us and said she wasn't sure how we took our coffee, so she got 1 black and 1 with cream and sugar. The small thoughtfulness of bringing coffee for both of us made my throat tight. Hala started talking about the wedding and how she couldn't stop replaying that moment in her mind. She said she's seen plenty of weddings that probably shouldn't happen, ceremonies where she could sense doubt or hesitation from the bride or groom. Usually there are signs in the weeks leading up to the wedding, cold feet or arguments or family drama that hints at problems. With us, though, everything seemed completely genuine right up until Carlos raised his hand to stop the ceremony. She said she'd been officiating weddings for 15 years and performed over 300 ceremonies, and she'd never seen anything remotely close to what Carlos did. Her words felt like validation somehow, proof that we weren't stupid or blind for not seeing it coming. She told us about other weddings where grooms or brides had doubts, ceremonies she'd paused to give couples a moment to reconsider, even one wedding where the bride called it off during the vows. But none of those situations involved someone redirecting their feelings to a sibling, and definitely not to a conjoined twin sister. Hala looked directly at Valerie and said what Carlos did was uniquely cruel, because he involved her without her consent, made her part of his betrayal in a way that violated her autonomy completely. She said Carlos didn't just hurt me by rejecting me at the altar. He also violated Valerie by projecting his delusions onto her and forcing her into a situation she never asked for or wanted. Hearing someone else name the specific harm done to Valerie helped me understand something I'd been struggling with. Valerie's trauma from that day was different from mine, but just as real and valid. I'd been so focused on my own pain of being rejected that I hadn't fully grasped how Carlos had used Valerie, turned her into an object of his fantasy without her permission. Valerie started crying quietly, and Hala reached across the table to squeeze her hand, then pulled back quickly like she wasn't sure if the touch was okay. We stayed at the coffee shop for almost 2 hours, Hala sharing stories from her years of officiating, and us talking about what the past 3 months had been like. When we finally left, Hala hugged us both and said to call her anytime, that she meant it about staying in touch. Back in our next joint therapy session with Nora, she asked us to talk about what our relationship would look like going forward. She said we'd spent months processing the trauma and working through the immediate aftermath, but we hadn't really discussed rebuilding or what comes after survival mode. Valerie shifted in her seat and admitted she was scared we'd never feel completely comfortable with each other again. She said there would always be this wedge between us, this knowledge that Carlos wanted her instead of me, and she didn't know how we'd ever get past that. The words hung in the air, and I felt Nora watching us both, waiting to see how I'd respond. I turned as much as I could to look at Valerie directly, and told her I didn't want her to be someone different or disappear or make herself smaller to make me feel better. The words came out raw and honest, surprising me with how much I meant them despite all the hurt and confusion still mixed in. Valerie started crying and said she'd been trying to be invisible since the wedding, trying to take up less physical and emotional space somehow. I could see it was true in the way she'd been holding herself the past few months, the way she'd been apologizing for existing. We sat there crying together while Nora let us have the moment without interrupting. Our next session 2 weeks later turned into what Nora later called a breakthrough. She asked us to identify unhealthy patterns in how we related to each other and the world, patterns that might have made us more vulnerable to what Carlos did. I admitted I'd been defining myself through romantic relationships my whole adult life, seeing them as proof of my individual worth and value as a person separate from being a conjoined twin. Every relationship was a test I was trying to pass, evidence that someone could see me as just me and not as part of a unit. Valerie said she'd been making herself small for years to help me have those relationships, erasing her own presence and preferences so I could feel more independent. She'd angle away on dates, wear headphones constantly, never voice her own opinions about my boyfriends even when she had concerns. Neither pattern was healthy, and both had set us up to be hurt by someone like Carlos, who seemed to validate my need to be seen as separate, while secretly fixating on Valerie. Nora helped us see how Carlos had exploited the exact dynamics we'd created, using my desperation to be chosen as an individual, and Valerie's habit of self-erasure to build his fantasy. 4 months after the wedding, I was at work when Ronan stopped by my desk with his lunch. He'd been doing that a lot lately, just casually eating lunch near me and making stupid jokes to try to get me to smile. That day he told me this ridiculous story about his neighbor's cat that somehow ended up in his apartment and knocked over his entire spice rack. The way he described finding the cat covered in paprika and turmeric was so absurd that I started laughing. The sound of my own laughter surprised me because I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything close to joy. The laugh came from somewhere deep in my chest and felt rusty from lack of use, but it was real and genuine. Valerie looked up from her book and smiled at me, and for just a second we looked at each other and acknowledged something important. Maybe we were going to be okay eventually, even if we weren't okay yet. The moment passed quickly, but it felt significant, like we'd crossed some invisible line from just surviving to actually living again. A few days later, an envelope arrived in our mail with Madeline's return address. My hands shook as I opened it because I didn't know what to expect from Carlos's mother. Inside was a handwritten letter on nice stationery, the kind people use for important correspondence. Madeline wrote that she'd been struggling with what to say to us for months, that she felt responsible somehow for not seeing signs of her son's issues earlier. She said she'd replayed every interaction trying to figure out when Carlos started developing his delusions about Valerie, but she couldn't pinpoint a moment. She apologized for Carlos's actions and for the pain he'd caused us both, even though she knew her apology couldn't undo the damage. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote that she understood if we never wanted to hear from their family again, but she wanted us to know she was thinking of us. Tucked inside the envelope was a check for $5,000 with a note saying it was to help cover some of the wedding costs, the least she could do given the circumstances. I showed everything to Valerie and we both sat there staring at the check. The money would help with the bills we were still paying off from the wedding, but the apology felt complicated because Madeline hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here she was trying to make amends for her adult son's choices. I sat with the letter and check for a long time, reading Madeline's words over and over while Valerie stayed quiet beside me. The money would help with the bills, but accepting it felt like keeping a door open to Carlos's family that I needed to close. I showed Valerie the amount and she nodded slowly, understanding without me having to explain. We talked about it that night and agreed that we needed to cut contact completely, that every interaction with Madeline or Tyler would be a reminder of the wedding and what Carlos did. I drafted a polite email thanking Madeline for the apology and the check, explaining that we needed space to heal and wouldn't be maintaining contact going forward. Tyler responded within hours saying he understood completely and hoped we would find peace, that he wouldn't reach out again unless we contacted him first. His message was kind and respectful, and made me sad because Tyler had been a good friend during the engagement, but letting go of Carlos's family felt necessary even though it hurt. Cutting those ties added another layer of grief to process, because I'd imagined holiday dinners with Madeline and game nights with Tyler, a whole future family that disappeared when Carlos stopped the wedding. At our next therapy session, Valerie was quieter than usual and kept fidgeting with her hands. Nora noticed and asked what was going on, and Valerie took a deep breath before speaking. She said she'd been afraid for months that I would resent her forever, that being conjoined meant I could never fully get away from the person Carlos chose over me. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I felt my chest tighten because I hadn't realized she was carrying that specific fear. Nora leaned forward and said something that shifted both our perspectives. She pointed out that Valerie wasn't actually the person Carlos chose because Carlos never knew Valerie as a real person. He'd created a fantasy based on proximity and projection. Carlos had built an entire imaginary version of Valerie in his head that had nothing to do with who she actually was. The reframing helped me see that Carlos's delusion wasn't about Valerie's real self any more than his initial love for me had been about my real self. He'd been relating to fantasies the whole time. Valerie started crying and said she'd been so worried that some part of her had actually encouraged him without meaning to. But Nora explained that Carlos's issues with intimacy and commitment had created the delusion regardless of anything Valerie did or didn't do. 5 months after the wedding, we started making deliberate choices to create new memories that weren't connected to Carlos. We found a different coffee shop across town that became our new regular spot, a place with comfortable chairs and good Wi-Fi where we could sit for hours without anyone bothering us. The coffee shop where I'd met Carlos stayed off limits by unspoken agreement because neither of us wanted to walk past the table where he'd first asked for my number. We also started a weekly movie night with Ronan at our apartment, just the 3 of us with pizza and whatever film Ronan picked from his extensive collection of ridiculous action movies. Those Friday nights became something I looked forward to because they were purely about friendship and laughter, with no romantic complications or painful associations. We were building positive experiences to layer over the trauma, not trying to erase what happened but making it less central to our story. One afternoon at work, I caught myself wondering what it would be like to go on a date again, and immediately felt guilty. Like thinking about dating was somehow betraying the seriousness of what Carlos had done. The thought made me feel disloyal to my own pain, and to Valerie, who'd been hurt just as badly. At our next therapy session, I mentioned it to Nora, and she surprised me by saying it was actually healthy that I was considering future relationships, even if I wasn't ready yet. She explained that thinking about dating meant Carlos hadn't destroyed my ability to hope or to imagine connection with someone new. Valerie spoke up then, and admitted she was scared of me dating again, because what if the same thing happened? What if another guy developed feelings for her instead? I realized we needed to work through this fear together before I could actually move forward, because Valerie's anxiety about my dating would affect both of us, given our physical connection. We spent the rest of that session and the next one having an honest conversation about what dating would look like for me in the future. We talked about all the complications that came with being conjoined, how any relationship I had would involve Valerie by necessity, even though she'd try to give us privacy. Valerie said she didn't want me to give up on relationships because of what Carlos did, but she needed me to choose partners more carefully and watch for warning signs. I agreed and admitted something I'd been avoiding, that I'd ignored some red flags with Carlos because I was so grateful someone seemed to accept our situation. Looking back, I could see moments where Carlos had been too interested in our conjoined status, asking too many questions about how we coordinated things, but I'd dismissed my discomfort because he was otherwise so perfect. 6 months after the wedding, Nora gave us a new exercise in therapy. She asked us each to describe our individual identities separate from being conjoined twins, to talk about ourselves without referencing our physical connection. The request was harder than it should have been because we'd been defined by being conjoined our entire lives. It was the first thing people noticed, and often the only thing they saw. I struggled to find words at first, but eventually talked about my work in administration, and how I was good at organizing systems, about my sense of humor that leaned toward sarcasm, about my determination to keep trying even when things were hard. Valerie described her creativity and love of writing, her empathy that made her good at understanding other people's feelings, her quiet strength that let her handle difficult situations without falling apart. Listening to her talk about herself as an individual person made me realize how often I thought of us as a unit, rather than 2 separate people who happened to share a body. The exercise helped us both start seeing ourselves as individuals with distinct personalities and interests, not just as the conjoined twins. A few days later, Valerie asked if I wanted to read something she'd written for her creative writing class. She'd never shown me her writing before because it was the one thing that was entirely hers, but now she was choosing to share it with me. The short story was beautiful and sad, about a woman learning to navigate grief after losing her mother. It had nothing to do with being conjoined or with what happened at the wedding, just a moving exploration of loss and memory that showed how talented Valerie was. I told her I was proud of her, and meant it completely, and she looked at me with this expression, like she'd been waiting months to hear those words. We sat together quietly after that, and I felt closer to her than I had since before the wedding, connected by choice rather than just by our shared body. Tyler sent one final message a few weeks later with news that Carlos had moved to a different state for a fresh start. The physical distance felt like a weight lifting off both of us because it meant Carlos was far away and unlikely to show up unexpectedly. Tyler confirmed that Carlos was in intensive therapy and had finally accepted that his feelings for Valerie were a delusion, based on his own issues with intimacy and commitment. The explanation didn't excuse what Carlos did or make the damage less real, but it helped somehow to know he was getting professional help and was hundreds of miles away from us. 7 months after the wedding, I went on a casual coffee date with someone I'd met through work. His name was Jerry, and he worked in the IT department. We'd been chatting at lunch for a few weeks, and he'd asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. Valerie brought her laptop and worked on her writing while I talked to Jerry about his job and his hobbies. The date was fine, but not special. The conversation pleasant without any real spark or connection. I was okay with that because it proved I could go on a date without it being everything, without putting all my hopes for validation into one person. Afterward, Valerie asked if I was okay, and I realized she'd been anxious the whole time, worried about me getting hurt again, or about Jerry developing inappropriate feelings for her. We talked about her anxiety, and I promised to be more careful and more aware of warning signs going forward. Our next therapy session focused specifically on how to support each other through future relationships without losing our individual identities or repeating old patterns. Nora helped us establish boundaries and communication strategies that respected both our physical connection and our emotional separateness. We practiced ways Valerie could signal if she felt uncomfortable with someone I was dating, and ways I could check in with her without making her responsible for my romantic choices. Nora gave us practical tools for navigating the unique challenges of dating while conjoined, like how to create privacy within our shared physical space, and how to maintain separate emotional lives even though we experienced many things together. The session felt helpful and concrete rather than just theoretical, giving us actual strategies we could use going forward. Walking out of Nora's office that day, I felt like we had a roadmap for the future that acknowledged our reality without letting it limit us completely. 8 months after the wedding, Ronan told me about a support group that met Tuesday evenings at a community center downtown. The group was for people who'd experienced public humiliation or betrayal, and he thought it might help us feel less alone in what we'd been through. Valerie was nervous about going, but agreed to try one session, so we showed up on a rainy Tuesday and found 12 other people sitting in a circle of folding chairs. The facilitator was a woman in her 50s who welcomed us and explained that everything shared in the room stayed confidential. We listened to a man talk about being fired in front of his entire department for something he didn't do, and a woman describe her husband leaving her at their anniversary party for her cousin. Each story was different, but they all had that same core of public shame, of having your worst moment witnessed by everyone you knew. When it was our turn to share, I gave the basic facts about Carlos stopping our wedding to confess love for Valerie, and the room went completely silent for a moment before people started nodding with understanding. After the meeting ended, 3 people came up to us separately to say they were sorry, and that what happened to us was uniquely awful. Valerie was quiet on the drive home, but the next Tuesday she said she wanted to go back and we started attending regularly. The 4th week we attended, the facilitator asked if anyone had something they needed to get off their chest, and Valerie raised her hand before I could even process what was happening. She talked about how she felt like she'd ruined my life just by existing, how she carried guilt for being the object of Carlos's delusion, even though she never encouraged him. She cried while she spoke and her voice shook, but she got through the whole thing without stopping. The group responded with such kindness and validation, telling her that she was a victim too, that Carlos had violated her consent by making her part of his fantasy. I reached over and squeezed her hand and told her I was proud of her, and she looked at me with this expression of relief like she'd been waiting months to hear those exact words. Our birthday fell on a Saturday 2 weeks after that support group session, and we decided to do something different this year instead of our usual joint celebration. We each picked one activity and one meal, and we spent the morning doing what I wanted, which was going to a farmer's market, and then getting brunch at this cafe I loved. Valerie brought her laptop and worked on her writing while I browsed the market stalls and talked to vendors, and it felt good to do something that was mine while she did her own thing in the same space. In the afternoon, we did Valerie's choice, which was visiting a botanical garden and then getting Thai food for dinner. I brought a book and read on the benches while she took her time looking at every plant and taking photos on her phone. The day wasn't about us being conjoined twins having a birthday. It was about 2 separate people who happened to share a birthday, celebrating the things that made them individually happy. That small shift in perspective felt huge, like we were finally seeing ourselves as individuals who shared a body rather than just one unit. 9 months after the wedding, Nora scheduled what she called a termination session to discuss ending our regular weekly therapy. We'd been meeting with her every week since a month after the wedding, and she felt we'd done the hardest work of processing the trauma and rebuilding our relationship. She explained that we were ready to move to as-needed sessions, that we'd developed the tools to handle challenges without weekly therapeutic support. The idea scared both of us because therapy had become this anchor in our week, this guaranteed space to work through everything. Nora reminded us that ending regular sessions didn't mean we couldn't come back if we needed to, that her door was always open for check-ins or crisis support. She said the fact that we were scared to stop was actually a good sign, proof that we'd formed a healthy therapeutic relationship and done real work together. We agreed to try it, to practice living without the weekly structure and see how we managed on our own. Walking out of her office that day felt different from all the other times, more final but also like an accomplishment, evidence that we'd healed enough to move forward without constant professional support. 2 weeks after our last regular therapy session, Valerie and I were sitting in our apartment on an ordinary Wednesday evening. She was working on a short story at her laptop, and I was reading a book I'd picked up at the library, and I realized the moment felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since before the wedding. We weren't fixed or back to how we were before Carlos, but we were okay in a new way that acknowledged what happened and how it changed us. The trauma was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it wasn't defining every moment of our lives anymore. Valerie looked up from her laptop and caught me watching her, and we shared a smile that didn't need any words to explain it. That smile said we were going to be all right, that we'd survived the worst thing we could imagine, and came out stronger together, that our bond as sisters was more powerful than any betrayal or humiliation. She went back to her writing, and I went back to my book, and we sat there in comfortable silence, two people connected by body and choice, moving forward into whatever came next.